All right. Well, it is 11 o'clock, so I hope you all had a chance to just stretch your legs there for a minute, and we're going to jump into our next round of presentations. So this is our session on breaking down barriers between science and application. So it's very tools focused this round, and we're going to be set up a little different than the last session. And so the way this will work is we're going to have 4 speakers. They're going to present one after another, each for about 8 minutes. And then when everyone's presentations are done, we're going to go into kind of a group question and answer session. So you can add your questions to the chat at any point during this, and we'll come to those questions at the end. So we are going to go ahead and get started. I will introduce our first speaker here. This is Anna Marr, who is working at the Pacific Northwest Research Station with the Forest Service. And I'm going to turn on over to Anna so we can just get started.
Great. Good morning. My name is Anna Marr. I'm an economist with the USDA Forest Service. I'm noticing that this is in my screen. I'm just going to move that out of the way. USDA Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station. And today I'll be telling you about an online resource of decision support tools that I created as part of a fellowship supported by the USDA Northwest Climate Hub and the USDA US Forest Service through the Oak Ridge Institute for Science and Education. I just want to do a quick check. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Great. I decided not to wear my headphones, but I think that's going to be an okay choice. This compendium resource I will share with you today was created thanks to collaborative efforts between both rangeland managers and scientists, including Holly Prendeville and Jessica Halasi at the Northwest Climate Hub and Robert Garcia at the US Forest Service. Before I jump into the compendium of decision support tools, I'll provide a little background about the challenges managers face with climate change in rangelands in the Northwest. This shows rangelands and forests across Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, with rangelands in yellow and forested areas in green. As we can see here in yellow, much of what we think of as rangelands in the Northwest are east of the Cascade Mountains and in semi-arid cold desert areas consisting of shrublands such as sagebrush steppe. This is a summary of projected climate change effects and therefore key challenges managers are facing on Northwest rangelands. Of course, they're expected to be variation in time and space as to these effects, but in general, scientists anticipate size and frequency of fires increasing, frequency of drought and intense heat increasing, snowpack decreasing, and precipitation falling as rain increasing, variability in precipitation increasing, and also variability in forage production increasing. In addition to facing intensifying climate change effects, managers are dealing with existing problems with recovery from disturbances such as drought and fire. Being that we are at the Northwest risk, many of you might be familiar with this particular challenge, that is with the impacts of invasive annual grass fire cycles on biodiversity and other ecosystem services. In this diagram, we show an example of uncharacteristic fire regimes moving a diverse plant community to a monoculture. Under the right conditions, this can happen within a relatively short period of time, like 15 to 20 years. And this is already happening in some places in the Northwest, and people are very concerned about the effect that this has on ecosystem services and management needs. So what can we do about it? Several online tools exist to support awareness of important and evolving issues, both climate change related and otherwise. For example, this tool estimates annual herbaceous cover, which is meant to be a good approximation for invasive annual grasses in the region. Many online tools like these exist and provide a friendly interface for people to access satellite and other geospatially linked data. These visual aids often are in the forms of graphs or maps like you see here. And this may help people to communicate management needs with the public, permittees, amongst peers and others. While there are tools that might be relevant to management, the Northwest Climate Hub had long been hearing from land managers that there were too many tools in general out there, and it was hard to decide which were relevant, which were being kept up to date. So we spent some time working with land managers, vetting relevant tools, and also coming up with a web page format that would be helpful for land managers. Enter this resource that we launched just this last March. I'm showing a snapshot of the front page and the web page address. I will also post this into the chat for you when we get done here. So in talking to managers, we learned that managers are tasked with both. So a little bit about the web page organization. In talking to managers, we learned that they're tasked with within-year management needs, such as springtime and growing season meetings with permittees and others. More specifically, within-year tools provide information about the likelihood of drought, fire, and forage production changes. In addition to within-year tasks, managers plan for range improvements and treatments. So more specifically, multi-year tools provide information that can support allotment management plans and climate adaptation plans. If you go to the webpage, you'll find tools organized like this. Within-year tool topics are under these categories of fire, drought, temperature, precipitation, and snowpack, stream flow, and also vegetation production. Multi-year tool topics are under these additional categories: adaptation and treatment, temperature and precipitation, and historical vegetation dynamics. I can talk more about some of the benefits or potential specifics about some of these tools if you're interested in our discussion. One final point I'd like to make before I wrap up. This website was created by forming partnerships between land managers and scientists. Since the panel topic today is breaking down barriers between science and application, I just wanted to share a bit about my experience of putting this webpage together with those folks. I believe I used to think of land managers as the application people. For, better or worse, that's just what I thought. And after this project, I'm questioning this assumption. I learned that scientists can have a great deal to offer in terms of expertise, and it is often their job to study and apply effective practices in an experimental setting. Scientists can also be an important part of creating decision support tools and provide climate change projections. They are also tasked with publishing papers and furthering their field. So I also learned that land managers are often on the front line of some of these issues pertaining to drought and wildfire. As a result, they can be well informed regarding timely manners and can have practical mindsets. Land managers can also have excellent relationship building expertise and essential boots on the ground knowledge. So all of these skills can be critical to effective climate adaptation, in my opinion. And managers are also typically already tasked with a long list of pressing issues needed to support timely, urgent public needs. So in closing, how do we as a science management community address these issues? In my personal experience through this project, I found conversations between land managers and scientists to be important to fruitful outcomes. So how do we have more science management conversations like these surrounding and centered around preparing for climate change? I think I have one more slide here, which just says, thank you. And here's my contact information. And I'll go ahead and post that webpage resource for you in the chat.
Great, thanks so much, Anna. We're going to jump right into our next talk. This next talk is from Lindsay Thurman, who is part of our Northwest Risk Core team and also is with the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. Whenever you are ready, Lindsay, you can jump on.
All right. Let me just share my screen real quick. Okay. Yeah, thank you all for coming. So The focus of this talk is going to be on the topic of adaptive capacity, which is a part of the climate change vulnerability assessment components. And typically this is done to evaluate species of conservation concern. So species that are desirable and that we wish to protect. And through many conversations I've had, the question of what does this mean for invasive species always comes up. And, could we, because it's a trait-based framework that I'll be sharing about. And so it's natural for folks to say, well, if we're looking at traits, what does this mean for invasive species? So I thought I'd share some sort of emerging ideas and directions of our adaptive capacity work group and this framework that we've developed, and how we are now kind of flipping the script on this to think about its applications to managing invasive species in a changing climate. And I want to acknowledge the really growing and diverse group of folks and their institutions that have contributed to this working group over the last several years. It's really an awesome dynamic group. And I just want to acknowledge that this is not just me doing this work, but all of these wonderful folks as well. So some background for those of you that are new to either the climate adaptation or climate change vulnerability world. We typically evaluate climate change vulnerability for, in this case, I'm focusing on species or populations of species. This also does have applications to human socioecological systems, but I focus on species. And so vulnerability assessments typically and traditionally evaluate three components: exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Exposure is the rate and magnitude of climate change that is experienced by the species or population. It can be described by changes or forecasted changes in annual conditions, seasonal conditions. We now are very concerned about extreme events, the velocity of changes, thresholds, that sort of thing. And then sensitivity is, the way I like to describe it, is sort of the dose response or susceptibility, degree of susceptibility, of species to climate change. You can think of, for example, an amphibian species that may be more sensitive to things like drought or extreme heat events than they would be, mean annual shifts in temperature or precipitation over long time frames. And together, these two factors comprise the potential impact of climate change on a species. And that is moderated by the species' adaptive capacity, or their ability to cope with or adjust to those changes, altogether making up the vulnerability of the species. And this work group and my work for the last about 7 years has focused on operationalizing this topic, or this concept of adaptive capacity. It's been a bit of a black box in the vulnerability assessment world for many years. And through our workshopping and work group efforts, we co-produced this decision support framework for practitioners that allows them to evaluate species adaptive capacity through this trait, or we call attribute-based assessment framework. And it focuses on species adaptive capacity through the lens of their ability to persist in place, which is the ability to adapt in situ or acclimate where they currently exist, versus their ability to potentially shift in space or track that suitable climate niche across the landscape. For some species, of course, they will have neither of these abilities and may, go extinct. But for the purposes of this assessment framework, we focus just on this sort of persist in place versus shift in space framing. And one of the primary focuses of adaptive capacity, and the reason we did a trait-based assessment, is that evaluating species traits has always been sort of a natural way to understand their ecology, their life history, their evolutionary adaptation abilities. And so it was just a natural segue for us to focus on traits. There was some early work by Nykotra et al., and I cite this paper down here at the bottom in case you're interested, where they first kind of dived into this idea of evaluating adaptive capacity through species traits. And you can think of, things like rapid life histories, high genetic diversity, those ecological generalist species, ones with broad physiological tolerances. And many of us started to think, well, God, this is exactly like invasive species, right? So I did a quick literature review since I'm somewhat new to the invasive species world and came up with a short list of common invasive species traits that exactly mirrored our traits that we use to assess adaptive capacity. And there were some additional ones like the invasion history, some links to human activities, and other things related to species interactions and environmental tolerances. But in general, they were nearly identical. So, just to like re-emphasize this point, I went back to the definition of adaptive capacity, which from the IPCC's assessment report a few years back, it was defined as the potential capability or ability of a species, ecosystem, or human system to adjust to climate change, moderate potential damage, take advantage of opportunities, or respond to the consequences. So essentially, it's how do species survive? And if we think of this through invasion potential, it's really focusing on how species thrive as invaders, taking advantage of those opportunities. So through our trait-based framework, we do this assessment of 36 traits. This is our wheel of fortune of traits. For some species, we jokingly call it the wheel of misfortune. But you go through a trait-based assessment process, and it links to that persistent place or shift in space framework. But I was thinking about like, okay, could we do this for invasive species? And oops, sorry, that one was not supposed to be in there. So I was like, okay, well, we have these groups of traits, right? Well, the distribution traits are kind of linked to species, the transport phase of invasion. And then you have traits that link to the introduction phase of the invasion, the establishment and spread phases. So it was starting to build out for me. And so the way that the framework works is you do this assessment and it produces these lovely figures here. And I'm going to go through it pretty quickly since we're kind of short on time. But it arrays the adaptive capacity from low to high or red to dark blue. And the length of the spokes of the wheel indicate the strength of evidence. So shorter spokes have less evidence or less certainty, you could say, in the assessment. And as I mentioned earlier, we typically do this for species of conservation concern. Here, the western bumblebee, obviously, one of our really valued pollinators, right, has fairly low adaptive capacity. So I was like, all right, let's do this for an invasive species. So I did it for the American bullfrog. And I was not surprised that all but one trait was in the moderate to high adaptive capacity category. And so the ideas that we're currently pursuing relate to how we can link these trait-based assessments to selecting adaptation, management actions. And in this case, it would be kind of like, rapid response actions for invasive species. And usually what we encourage folks to do is to find the, Achilles heel or the, strengths or potential management levers that the species may have. And those are where we focus in on management. And so to think of it through the lens of invasive species, it would be kind of the opposite. You'd be looking at reducing those strengths and capitalizing on their weaknesses, through that management lens. And so if you're more interested in any of this adaptive capacity work, we do have a website you can go to that is just a Google Drive folder. It has a quick reference guide, a how-to guide in there. And if you'd like to talk to me more about this link to invasive species, I'd be happy to do that and talk about how to walk through the trait-based framework. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. I'm sure we're going to get some awesome questions for you there. That's a really interesting work you've been doing. I am going to introduce our next speaker here. So our next speaker is Brittany Barker. Brittany's coming from the Oregon IPM Center and the Department of Horticulture at Oregon State University. Brittany, whenever you are ready, you are welcome to turn on your camera, and it looks like you're sharing your screen too. So we're all set. I can see your screen. I can't see you yet. I also cannot hear you.
Sorry about that.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Okay. Sure.
Perfect.
Okay. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, all right, great. Thanks everybody. I know it's getting close to lunchtime. People are probably antsy to go eat something and take a break. Thanks for sticking around. So my name's Brittany Barker. I'm a senior research associate at the Oregon IPM Center at Oregon State University. And thanks for taking the time to listen to me today. So I'm going to talk about real-time forecasts of phenology and climate suitability for invasive species, a particular decision support tool that I have been working on a lot at the Oregon IPM Center. Okay, so a critical question to address when conducting surveillance and management of invasive species is when and where we expect invasions to occur. In particular, we need to know what time of year important phenological events, such as, for example, for an insect might be first spring emergence, when those will occur, and also to identify which areas on the landscape are at highest risk of establishment. This information can potentially make surveillance efforts more efficient and effective because we won't waste our time looking for species at the wrong time of year and in the wrong place. However, as kind of noted previously by Martina, climate is changing rapidly, right? And invasive species are responding to that. So we need models that are based on current and future climate conditions. In other words, what I'm going to be talking about are these real-time models. So models based on the climate data for the current year, because models based on historical climates, for example, like averages of historical climates, may not produce realistic estimates of phenology and risk of establishment. As we can see in this map here, if average temperature anomalies for 2022, temperatures have increased by several degrees Celsius in most terrestrial regions of the world, compared to the 1981 to 2010 baseline. And due to these warming conditions, some invasive species are developing more quickly, and they're staying active for longer periods throughout the year. Some are also expanding their range into areas that were previously too cold for establishment, for example, expanding elevationally or northwards. So at the Oregon IPM Center, a lot of my research since I began there several years ago has been focused on developing this modeling platform called DDRP. It stands for Degree Day Establishment Risk and Phenological Event Maps. And a distinguishing feature of this platform is its ability to integrate phenology and climate suitability mapping. It accepts climate data for any time period. However, we designed it to produce forecasts for the present day or up to 7 months into the future. So we use it for the current year, based on climate data for the current year. It uses a process-based approach in which an organism moves through its life cycle as heat units called degree days accumulate. So we're assuming this is an ectothermic organism, so its development is driven by temperature. And risk of establishment is estimated by determining where the species is likely going to be excluded by very cold or very hot temperatures that limit its survival. So this is not a statistical model, okay? So I'm not using like occurrence records and correlating them with climate. This is based on physiological parameters of the organism. So the platform is written in the R programming language. You can access it at my GitHub account at github.com/bbarker505//DDRP_V2. And you can also read more details about the program at our PLOS One publication from 2020. So to date, DDRP models have been developed for 16 species of invasive insects that represent major threats to agricultural production in the United States, including pests that attack forest trees, grains, fruits, and vegetables. So 2 species on this list of the invasive insect species, emerald ash borer and light brown apple moth, have either established in Oregon or I think in the case of light brown apple moth, they are eradicated. Many of these other species are not yet present, or hopefully they will not become present in the conterminous United States and CONUS. But the purpose of these forecasts is to try to make sure that they don't become established. So by forecasting their phenology and climate suitability, we can get a better understanding of where and when to look for them. So we also developed models for 3 species of biological control insects that target Japanese knotweed, purple loosestrife, and tamarisk. Additionally, we're developing a version of DDRP that includes moisture factors in addition to temperature factors in order to model pathogens, so plant pathogens. And we've developed a model for a fungal pathogen that causes boxwood blight. The model documentation, also the homepage for DDRP, is listed on this webpage, uspest.org/caps. And it seems like QR codes are becoming pretty big these days, so I generated a QR code too. So you may access model forecasts for the 16 invasive insect species, like I mentioned, at uspest.org/caps. And you can also find the model documentations and links to our publications. So when you visit the website, you'll see a table. And when you click on the abbreviation of the species, so for example, in the first row, we have Asian longhorn beetle. When you click on that ALB, you can access all the different model outputs. And these are updated every 2 to 3 days. So like I mentioned, they're real-time forecasts, so they're regularly updated. And the outputs are in raster format, these GeoTIFF files, and also in static image format, so these PNG files. And the rest of the columns show outputs of DDRP that are likely to be really relevant to decision support. These include what we call phenological event maps, showing first spring adults and first egg hatch. Okay, so this is an example of a forecast produced by DDRP. Again, it's called a phenological event map, and it is using climate data for 2021 from the DayMet database. And this is for emerald ash borer, Agrillus planopennis. I don't really have time to go into much information about the species, but all of you are probably aware that emerald ash borer was detected for the first time in Forest Grove, Oregon last year. To my knowledge, they have not eradicated it. And so it's really important to have predictions of first adult emergence because emerald ash borer spends most of its life inside of a tree. And so the adults are really the only, very visible stage that we know that has invaded an area. Okay, so the applications of real-time forecasts are that we can understand when we need to install traps. So, have the traps out before adults emerge. And also apply timely insecticide treatment. So we need time for the insecticides to move up and through the tree and into the leaves when the emerald ash borer begins feeding. And also we can understand establishment risk. So in the case of emerald ash borer, this species does have a very wide climate tolerance. And that's one of the reasons that I use climate data for all of North America is, because emerald ash borer is in Canada. So I'm going to walk you through this map right here. First of all, notice this blue line. So that represents the approximate range boundary of 16 species of native ash or Fraxinus species. So, the emerald ash borer, it needs its host. So obviously it's also confined to areas where its host occurs. And within this blue line, you'll see these colors here, which are the predictions of the date in which adults are predicted to emerge. So we see that adults emerge as early as late January and early February down in the south. And then up in Canada, they could emerge as late July or early August. Up here where these light gray areas are, this represents that emerald ash borer had insufficient degree days for the adult emergence to occur. And also notice on this map, we have these medium and dark gray colors. This represents areas where emerald ash borer is predicted to be excluded by either severe or moderate or severe cold stress or moderate or severe heat stress. So these areas are too cold or too hot for survival. And unfortunately, with the exception of a small area of northern Mexico, and then also up here in parts of Canada, the whole pretty much, especially within the range of its host species, most of the range of its hosts is climatically suitable. However, it could be that up in like Saskatchewan and Manitoba, there are some areas where at least establishment could be temporarily prohibited for emerald ash borer. Okay, and this work was published a couple of weeks ago in Frontiers in Insect Science, so you can check that out. The forecasts for emerald ash borer are also available at the USA National Phenology Network at usampn.org/data/forecasts/EAB. And it's also cool because the National Phenology Network has these pheno forecasts where you can this interactive tool where you can zoom in and pan the map and also click on individual pixels to see what the prediction is for a location. You can also sign up for email notifications. And in the pheno forecast series, we have maps of adult emergence and also maps for egg hatch. And notice that this map looks a little bit different than the one I was showing you before. So instead of showing dates, this map is showing you on March 31st of 2023, this is when we would expect adults to emerge. So emergence is occurring next week down south, whereas up in Oregon, emergence wasn't predicted to occur until more than 2 months later. Or in 2 months or later. So around Forest Grove, where emerald ash borer is detected, the prediction is showing June 25th. And this is great because actually Emerald Ash Borer emerged on June 28th. So we have generally found really good support for predictive accuracy of our model, of the phenology model, particularly for adult events. Our next steps are to expand DDRP's moisture processing features. In particular, we are incorporating abilities for it to process soil moisture active passive data from the NASA SMAP satellite mission. And this will allow us to model moisture sensitive species such as invasive plants like cheatgrass, which is a species that we're starting to work on. We're going to model new major invasive species, including a few fungal pathogens in the Monolinia genus that cause brown rot and stone fruits, a model for Japanese beetle, a model for cheatgrass, also called downy brome or Bromus tectorum. And we're currently working on a model for spotted lanternfly. And our collaborators at USA National Phenology Network are really leading the work in conducting outreach to promote our products and also to solicit observations. So have citizen scientists and other professionals go out in the field and observe phenology of these species, enter their data, and that'll be stored in Nature's Notebook database. And with that, here's all the links that I shared throughout my presentation, and feel free to reach out to me. And I also just wanted to put a quick plug in about a postdoc opportunity that is not advertised yet, but I just reach out to me if you're interested. If you think this type of modeling work is cool and you like working on insects and plants, we have a new grant coming up for studying a new biocontrol agent for yellow star thistle, the rosette weevil, and we're going to be developing models similar to what I just presented to you. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Brittany. We are going to go ahead and just move right into our next presentation. So next we have Jen Poirier, who is going to be talking with us about some fish work. Jen, whenever you are ready, go ahead and share your screen and go ahead.
Hopefully that looks okay and you can hear me.
Looks great. We can hear
perfect.
you. Thank you.
Great. Yes, once again, my name is Jen Poirier. I'm a fish biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service out of our Columbia River Fish and Wildlife Conservation Office in Vancouver, Washington. And this is going to be pretty obvious, but my talk takes a little bit of a diversion from the previous three speakers. And I'm going to be talking about a novel fish control technique. It's using YY males to eradicate a non-native population of brook trout in a small stream. So brook trout are one of the most prevalent non-native species in the Western United States. Unfortunately, once they become established, they are almost impossible to control or eradicate completely. And many of the common fish control tools that are used to eradicate invasive fish species, such as electrofishing or the application of chemical treatments, are often really labor intensive. They're definitely very harmful to the aquatic ecosystem, and they often require many, many years of treatment. And even then, they don't necessarily work successfully. So one of the more novel fish control tools that's being utilized now to eradicate non-native brook trout is called the YY male technique. And so this technique involves producing male brook trout with 2 Y chromosomes, and these fish are then released into the population that's been targeted for eradication. And when these YY males spawn with a typical female, all of the progeny will be male. So after a period of time, the population shifts, the sex shifts to all male. And so eventually this leads to the extirpation of the population by reproductive failure. So the Idaho Department of Fish and Game has produced a broodstock of these YY male brook trout that are being used now for experiments. And we have started a number of field stocking trials in at least 6 different Western states. And I'll be talking about one of these projects today. And unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about the actual production of the YY males, but I do encourage you to check out Schill et al. 2016 for more information. So our project is located in Tyee Springs, which is a tiny little tributary of the Wind River in Western Washington State. And it also happens to be the primary water source for Carson National Fish Hatchery. This is where a non-native population of brook trout has been present since about the mid-1960s. And as you can imagine, it's not ideal to have a non-native species in your hatchery water source. So, the hatchery has spent decades trying to eradicate this population with very little success. And so after a lot of discussion, we really felt like Tyee Springs was probably one of the most perfect locations to test this YY male technique. As I mentioned, the stream is incredibly small. It's isolated, so there's no way for fish to move in from outside populations or out. And brook trout and sculpin are the only two species that are currently present in Tyee Springs, which is really optimal for our fish removals. But rather than jump straight into stocking YY males, because there was a little bit of apprehension about how is this going to work, how long is it going to take, we decided to walk through a population simulation exercise that would really help us determine the optimal fish suppression and YY stocking rates that might be needed to achieve successful eradication within a reasonable time frame. And so the first step of this process was to collect and estimate all of the population demographic information from our resident non-native population. And this was going to be used to inform our simulation model. And I unfortunately don't have time to walk you through this study in detail, but I did want to share the results from our two-way sensitivity analysis because this has kind of been the driving force for our project. So the numbers that you're looking at within these cells represent the median number of years to eradication in Tyee Springs, given varying levels of fish suppression, which is on the y-axis, and varying levels of YY male stocking rates on the x-axis. And so basically the take-home message here is that time to eradication is more sensitive to fish removals compared to our YY male stocking rates. So for us, this essentially meant that it really pays off to focus a lot of energy on that fish removal if you want to minimize that overall time to eradication. So based on these results, we have been targeting a 25 to 50% fish removal rate annually, followed by stocking 2,000 YY males. And so we started our fish removal efforts back in summer of 2020. And so far, we've removed about 6,700 brook trout. These are resident brook trout from Tyee Springs, most of which have been captured using our electrofishing barge that you can see in the top picture there. And we have stocked over 4,500 YY male fish in the last 4 years. So we're finishing up, we're kind of wrapping up year 4 of our project. Are we starting to see any signs of success? Tentatively, I would say yes. We are now starting to see kind of a shift in our sex ratios to male. This is a plot of brook trout that are less than 150 millimeters in length that were sexed during our fish removals back in 2021. And you can see our ratios are about 50-50. And now this is the same plot from our fish removals in 2022. And so we're now starting to see more males than females. And so we're cautiously optimistic that this is a sign that our YY males are surviving and they are reproducing successfully. Now we've also been collecting genetic samples from a lot of the juvenile young of year fish. And this is so we can determine whether they are the progeny of these YY male fish, which again would sort of confirm the success of our stocking efforts. So we're going to be analyzing those results those genetic samples in the next month or two. So we're keeping our fingers crossed that those results can kind of confirm these findings. So in addition to brook trout, the Idaho Department of Fish and Game is taking steps to begin the development of additional YY male brood stocks for other non-native fish species that are impacting sport fisheries in general. But before you get your hopes up, brown trout right now appear to be the most next likely candidate for the development of a brood stock. These other species that you see on the slide here are still many, many years out, but the work is being done currently. And just to wrap up with a few final thoughts about this control tool, it is not necessarily a standalone tool. It can be used alone, but it does work best, or it's most efficient when it's used in coordination or in collaboration with another fish control tool, such as electrofishing. This is because it shortens the time to eradication And it's also possible that it might minimize the impact to other native fish species that might be present in the stream. For the most part, many of the projects that are occurring, our general practice is to attempt to remove the same number of fish that we will be stocking so that there's no net increase in the number of fish in the system. Now, the YY male technique is not necessarily a silver bullet. It does work very well in its time and place. But in general, it's because of the hatchery intensive nature of rearing these YY males, it's very unlikely that it's going to be used on a large, broad landscape scale. We just simply don't have enough hatchery space. And not only that, but it would take, you know, a lot of resources. Additionally, it's possible that results may vary for other YY species. You know, we don't know yet because, you know, they haven't been tested. But what I will say is the reason that brook trout were kind of the first species that were developed, they tend to be found in these very small headwater streams. They mature very early, and they have a very short life expectancy compared to other species, so about 3 years. So eradication of brook trout is likely to occur much more quickly than for other longer-lived species, such as common carp, which have a life expectancy of anywhere from 8 to 15 years. So that would take a lot longer. And that being said, you know, these types of projects surprisingly take very little effort, but they do require a relatively long-term commitment. You know, based on our fish removal and our stocking rates, we estimate that we'll see complete eradication of brook trout within Tyee Springs in about 9 to 10 years. So not a short process, and it's definitely not a one and done. You can't stock and walk away. It does take multiple years of stocking to see success. And that's largely why we performed our feasibility study before we started stocking, so we could have a really good understanding of the potential time commitment that was going to be needed to see this project through to completion. And so with that, I just want to thank all of the people and folks that have made and continue to make this project possible. And I want to leave you with my contact information because I often get a lot of questions. And I also wanted to share this beautiful photo on the bottom right. All of the fish that we capture during our fish removals are donated to the Oregon Zoo, and they were kind enough to send us a picture of them feeding our brook trout to some of the polar bears. So with that, I think we will start our discussion.
Yes, thank you, Jen. That's a real fun photo to end on there with the polar bear. Can we have all of our panelists turn their cameras back on? All right, so for everybody who's in attendance today, please put any questions that you have into the chat, and we'll address them kind of as we move through this last 17 or so minutes. We'll ask our panelists some of your questions. So the first one, I'm just going to go right back to you, Jen. So we have a question again about the species that you all are working with for this technique. And this was specifically about yellow perch. Have you all looked into working with that species, or is there a particular reason why that's not a good candidate species?
So it's likely that it hasn't been looked at yet. And so the species, because the work is based out of Idaho, they've selected species that are impacting sport fisheries within Oregon, Washington, Idaho. So yellow perch has not been on the list. It would be interesting to see if they would be a candidate, because really it takes two things to make a YY fish. You have to be able to feminize male fish, and you have to be able to develop a genetic sex marker, that can differentiate the genotype of a fish. So you need to be able to tell if it's an XX, XY, YY. So it remains to be seen. It's not something that's being looked at the moment, but not to say it wouldn't be in the future.
Awesome, thank you. So there's a question kind of for all of you. So when you're working, especially with you folks that are developing, tools specifically to be used by others, how do you, when you're developing these tools, do you try to make sure that they're usable by your folks on the other side? What kind of techniques do you use, or thoughts do you put behind that? If somebody wants to jump in with an answer, you're welcome to do that. All right, Lindsay, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I can share like my personal experience with developing all the adaptive sorry, all the adaptive capacity related tools and resources. We follow the guidance of co-production, which is that all of our resources and tools are developed directly in partnership with end users. So we work with, federal, state agency practitioners, NGO folks, et cetera. And they're involved from start to finish. They shape the product and help us, define our objectives and all of that. So that's our main approach.
Sure. Does anyone else want to add to that? Yeah, Brittany.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add something. So I think in my case, like, if you have to work with the actual code that the tool I was presenting, you do have to know our programming. However, what I think is cool about our tool and also the ones that were presented today is that they're actually operationalized online. So people can just like look at the maps and maybe zoom in and like, so I think that like there's a lot of papers, publications, they present a model, but they don't actually make it available, or, they don't like have it available at a website. But yeah, related to the comment about co-production, we have collaborators who are really good at that. So at the National Phonology Network, they're surveying the stakeholders to see like what type of maps they like and what they want them to look like. So, like what they prefer, like what are their needs. And so I think that's definitely an important component when you're developing modeling tools or any sort of decision support tool.
Awesome. Thank you. Does anyone else want to add anything? So to kind of add on to that question, then, if there are folks that are listening that, are on the management side of things and they don't often get an opportunity to give feedback in these kinds of tools as they're developed, do you have any recommendations for folks for how they might get involved with researchers from that management side of co-production?
How they get involved with the researchers? So
yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, I think the first step would be contacting them. Like we're definitely like, I'm interested in collaborating, and I guess it just depends on the researcher, like how willing they are, to work with their stakeholders or collaborate. But yeah, I think that, yeah, people should definitely reach out. And researchers also should be making sure that they're communicating that they're interested in getting feedback and, figuring out what people's needs are for decision support.
There's also several what we call boundary spanning organizations. The Northwest Risk is a perfect example. The USGS Climate Adaptation Science Centers, where like one of their key missions is to link researchers and practitioners. So finding a point of contact at those organizations is a great way to figure out where those mutual interests are and opportunities for involvement.
Awesome. Thank you. Does anyone else want to add anything to that?
I was just curious if somebody had a good, this might cause a waterfall of information, but resource that they use for guidance on co-production that they could share, because that might be useful to folks, including myself.
Yeah, if anyone has a resource that they can share in the chat, if that's readily available, please share it now. And if it's not readily available, we'll track that down and try to share it with folks after the event. Great. Oh yeah, and Lindsay sent out a link there in the chat to an article. So thank you, Lindsay. So there's another question here. So Lindsay, you mentioned in your presentation that, one of the thoughts behind this kind of work is that you might be able to capitalize on weakening some of that adaptive capacity that invasive species have or seem to have. Do you have any kind of more concrete examples or ideas for what that might look like?
Yeah, I can give an example of, so I came out of grad school, I came out of an amphibian lab, and some of the folks in our lab worked on invasive American bullfrogs here in this region. And so this is sort of I'm sort of leveraging that work to answer this question. But as I showed in my slides, the bullfrog was one of the species that we've kind of applied this framework to. And one of its only weaknesses is its requirement on permanent water bodies to overwinter because it has a multi-year larval stage and really lacks that plasticity to metamorphose within a single year. And so managers often will take the approach of drying down their water resources, like I've seen this done on National Wildlife Refuge lands, as a way to, sort of attack them where they're sensitive. And in my mind, that's a great sort of adaptive capacity minded approach because you're capitalizing on the weaknesses of the species to target your management actions. And I think that's a pretty standard approach in invasive species management. But that's one of my favorite examples because I've seen it work successfully.
Yeah, that's a really cool example. Thanks so much for sharing, Lindsay. I've got another question here for you, Brittany. So all of those species that you've really worked on so far have been insects, is that correct? And you've got some more in the works?
Yeah. So my major collaborator, Len Coop at the Oregon IPM Center, he started working on this before, I arrived, but he had a contract with APHIS PPQ. And the Cooperative Agricultural Pest Survey Program specifically wanted to target these pests for surveillance. So like all those insects that I'm showing you. And yeah, and also Len is an entomologist. But yeah, I mean, it just kind of happened that way, but we're definitely, like I said, expanding its capabilities. And we're going to be starting to work on cheatgrass soon. And like I mentioned, we're figuring out a way to incorporate soil moisture data, and we just figured out a way for it to model infection risk for fungal pathogens. So yeah, it's definitely growing. It's just kind of that's just kind of been going on the last year or two.
That's great. So there's nothing like in particular about insects that makes them, a better fit for this kind of work. It's just the way that the project happened.
It kind of, yeah. And the way, like if you go to my GitHub account and look at the code, it's kind of set up to it has insect life stages. So like egg, larva, pupa, adults, right? And so we kind of have to reprogram it to like incorporate different life stages. But yeah, totally. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you. So I've got a question here for Anna. So I think there's probably tons of tools out there that could have been incorporated into your compendium. And it sounded like, managers are already overwhelmed by all these tools. So how did you, what was really challenging about, narrowing down which tools to actually include in a resource like that?
Yes, it was relatively informal, how we decided, but there were some really key obvious things. For example, it had to be up to date. There's a lot of tools out there that, the funding ran out for them, and they're no longer being kept up. And then also it had to be well, I'm thinking of one tool in particular that was just for Oregon. It didn't have, because this was for the Northwest, it didn't expand to Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. So there was another tool that did something similar, but was a broader scope. And so things like that. There's also conversations with managers asking, is this answering questions that are relevant to what you're doing? And most of the answers on that was yes. Sometimes they'd be answering different questions than I anticipated or things like that. But so that wasn't a huge weeding down, but really it wasn't, it was more about the organization. I felt like with a proper organization, people can handle the amount of information, and then also knowing that they're up to date and valid. So I think that was, it wasn't as much weeding. There wasn't as much weeding out of things as organizing them in a way that was palatable. So.
Thank you, Anna. I've got another follow-up question here for Brittany about, oh, it looks like you started to answer it in the chat, but maybe you can answer out loud too.
Okay, yeah, no, that's fine. Oh, go ahead. Do you want to read the question? Or...
Oh, yeah. So the question is about, just to expand a little bit more on the work that you're doing with cheatgrass and incorporating that into the tool. I think it's the question. Yeah.
Yeah, so we are working on importing and processing soil moisture active passive data. So that's a NASA satellite mission. And yeah, so once we have that, we're going to build our model so that there are both like temperature factors and soil moisture factors for the cheatgrass model. And I'm not sure how much soil moisture might improve prediction, so we're going to test that. We also have some folks over at USGS who develop remote sensing products for cheatgrass cover. So we may also collaborate with them to see like how the model predictions compare, because we're going to be modeling both establishment risk and phenology of cheatgrass, kind of similar to the insects. So yeah, this soil moisture active passive data is kind of interesting. It's our first time working with that data set, so trying to wrangle that. Yeah.
That's super cool. So yeah, working in new informative data sets. That sounds, yeah, like that'll be an interesting challenge. Yeah.
Yeah, remote sensing data, they're all in different formats too. You have to like learn the different file types and the different structures and all that. So yeah.
Right. Well, I think folks are going to be excited to see some of the additional species that they can learn about from your tool once they're out there. Yeah, so I'll give everybody just another minute to see if there are any other questions that float in from the chat. And if I don't see anything else in there, then we're going to go ahead and wrap up our panel session for today.